A night full of fog. The fog enveloped the land, creating such a dense atmosphere that even the sounds seemed muffled. The bridge, where Daniel and his elderly boss, Mr. Whitmore, stood, was an abandoned, forgotten place. Its rusty railings creaked with age, and the old wooden planks, covered in moss and fungi, gave way underfoot, as if the bridge itself regretted its old age. Daniel, clutching an old suitcase in his hands, felt his breath quicken. His heart beat heavily, and his thoughts were tangled. He glanced at Whitmore, whose tired, yet trusting eyes met his. The strange calmness of the old man, who moved slowly behind him, leaning on his cane, seemed unbearably alien at that moment. "You are like a son to me, Daniel," Mr. Whitmore said softly, adding, "Don't worry, everything will be fine." But Daniel could no longer keep it inside. A mixture of doubt and resolve reflected on his face, while a storm boiled inside him. His mind was consumed by despair. Debts, failed business ventures, lost dreams. He needed this. He deserved this. The man who had served for so many years now stood at the edge of the abyss, and it was only in this moment that Daniel realized he was willing to do anything for freedom. He looked down at the river, at the black water lazily lapping beneath the bridge. In that moment, when his thoughts were as taut as a string, and his heart was pounding in his chest, he made his decision. Part 2. Betrayal. Mr. Whitmore continued walking slowly, tired, his footsteps echoing on the empty bridge. He leaned heavily on his cane, struggling to climb the bridge as if unaware of what was happening around him. Daniel felt his trust, that noble calmness of the old man. But for Daniel, it no longer mattered. He turned around, doubt reflected on his face. Suddenly, his hand seemed to act on its own. He sharply pushed Whitmore. The old man looked at him with surprise, but his eyes didn't have time to understand what had happened. The cane fell to the bridge, and Whitmore's body disappeared into the foggy night water with a sharp splash. Daniel stood frozen, his breath coming in short gasps. He heard the old man's body disappear into the dark waters, his own heart pounding in his ears. The moment felt eternal, but suddenly, a sound broke through the thick silence. Footsteps, breathing. Daniel turned around. From the dark bushes, hiding in the shadows, Toby appeared. His amber eyes sparkled in the dim light of the moon, like a human's, full of wisdom and anger. This was Mr. Whitmore's faithful German shepherd. He had witnessed everything. Daniel froze. He knew this was no longer just a dog. Toby didn't bark, didn't growl. He just stood there, his gaze so deep that Daniel felt his soul tighten. This gaze wasn't just the look of an animal. It was a gaze that could understand everything. All his actions, all his betrayal. Daniel tried to push Toby away, but the dog simply turned and vanished into the darkness. It was strange. Why did he feel so uneasy from just a look? He tried to calm himself, but couldn't. He knew that now he had a witness. Part 3. Plans and Fear. Daniel stood up, struggling to catch his breath. Events were unfolding rapidly, and he understood that the time for reflection had long passed. He took Whitmore's cane and threw it into the river, watching it disappear into the dark waters. All that was left for him was to carry out his plan. Soon, Daniel was in the car, ready to return to Whitmore's estate. He knew that questions awaited him at the house. He had to play his role, to show concern and loss. His fate depended on it. Upon arriving at the estate, Daniel noticed that the house was strangely quiet. Usually, Whitmore always said something, his voice always calling for Toby, giving instructions. But today, there was silence. A dead silence filled the house. He entered the study. Toby was sitting in a chair near the fireplace. His fur was wet, and his eyes gleamed with a mix of sadness and fury, aimed directly at Daniel. For a moment, Daniel felt an icy chill spread through his body. This was no ordinary dog. It was something more. "Toby," Daniel said, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. "Good boy, calm down." But Toby didn't move. He just sat there, staring. With each passing moment, the dog's gaze grew more intense, piercing into Daniel's very soul. And suddenly, despite all his bravery, he understood. This gaze was an accusation. Part 4. Exposure. Toby stood up and slowly approached Daniel. It wasn't an aggressive move. It was the movement of something much older and more powerful than just a dog. He lifted his head as if understanding that his mission was more than just guarding. It was exposure. "Do you think you can escape the consequences?" The dog seemed to whisper in his thoughts. Toby took a step back, and his eyes no longer expressed fury, but sadness. He may have understood that in this story, he wasn't the only one who was a witness. Daniel turned, horrified, realizing that he had not only killed his boss, but had also severed the bond that had existed between them for many years. With this realization in his mind, he noticed how the dog, without saying a word, disappeared into the dark corridors of the house. But Daniel knew one thing. Even if he had destroyed Whitmore's physical body, the connection between them was unbreakable. Toby was a witness, and perhaps someday he would have to tell this story. Shadows of the past. Several days had passed since Daniel committed his terrible act. He continued living in Mr. Whitmore's estate, hiding his anxiety behind a mask of concern and feigned sadness. Immersed in matters that were merely a facade to conceal his guilt, he didn't notice how more and more he was losing touch with reality. At night, he was tormented by nightmares, in which the shadows of distorted faces and bloodied hands reached out to him, and a quiet voice echoed in the air, "You can't escape this." Every morning, he would find Toby sitting near his office. The dog showed no aggression, but its gaze was penetrating. He saw how it watched him, following his every step, and in its eyes burned not only sadness, but also a silent accusation. Daniel didn't know what to do about it. He tried to ignore the dog, thinking that if he showed his innocence, everything would sort itself out. But the thoughts of betrayal wouldn't let him rest. Again and again, he returned to that moment on the bridge, the shove, that terrifying moment when Whitmore disappeared into the river. He was certain that now he was free. But why, then, couldn't his soul shake the feeling that he had been caught, that his guilt could not be avoided? One day, when the rain poured down in torrents and the sky was covered with clouds, Daniel met the worst of his nightmares. Part 6. The Return. Daniel was sitting in his office, flipping through papers, when suddenly the door swung open and Toby entered the room. He stood in the doorway, his eyes gleaming, and his expression was not just calm but determined. The dog had never come into the office before. Its place was always by the fireplace or in the hallway. This was strange. Daniel flinched, standing up from his chair, and immediately realized that his hands were wet with sweat. He knew something was happening, something he couldn't ignore. Toby stepped forward, his heavy paws thudding on the floor. He stopped, not taking his eyes off Daniel, and suddenly his tail wagged slightly, as if the dog were trying to convey something important, something that words couldn't express. But Daniel could no longer look at him. He turned away and hurried toward the door. "Toby, not like this," he began, trying to justify himself. But at that moment, something strange happened. Toby suddenly leaped onto his hind legs and grabbed the collar of his coat with his teeth. Daniel froze, his heart stopped. Whitmore's dogs were always well-mannered and calm, never showing aggression without reason. He felt as though Toby was trying to stop him. It was almost as if the dog wanted to say, "You can't continue this. You won't escape without consequences." With each passing second, as Toby wouldn't let go, Daniel felt his guilt was impossible to ignore. He froze, unable to move, and in his mind, like thunder on a clear day, the voice of the old man rang out. "You think you can leave me behind?" Part 7. Exposure. Daniel panicked and jumped up, but suddenly remembered something important. Mr. Whitmore never left things unfinished. He was meticulous in every detail. Every document, every step in his life was calculated and recorded. And now, with the old man gone, Daniel realized there were things he hadn't thought about. He quickly returned to the desk, his hands trembling. He opened the last drawer and pulled out documents he hadn't seen before. Among them was one important file, which contained Mr. Whitmore's mysterious signature, as well as something like a warning. The paper read, "Toby is my witness. He will seek the truth." This document was dated a month before the incident on the bridge. Daniel realized that Mr. Whitmore might have already known about his intentions. Perhaps he had even prepared his dog in advance to watch over him and prevent his crime. He didn't know what to do, but something inside him told him that escaping was no longer possible. Part 8. Consequences. That night, when the rain didn't cease, Daniel looked one last time at Toby. The dog was no longer in the house, but the feeling of its presence lingered. He knew that now there was no escaping his fate. Perhaps exposure awaited him, not only in the eyes of others, but also in his own reflection. With every step he took, Daniel realized that no one could hide from the truth. Sometimes, even the most loyal creatures on earth, like Toby, know how to restore justice. No matter how hard he tried to run, no matter how much he convinced himself that he was in control of the situation, he understood that his actions had led to this moment, when the shadow of the past, and Toby's shadow as well, finally caught up to him. The story he had tried to hide was now too close.